G'day, wherever you are in this wonderful multiverses ours. Welcome to another edition of Mastering Music, Mastering Life. Tony Jack, the Bear Mance, in my little establishment of Deluxe Mastering in Melbourne, Australia. And before we start, I must say a quick thank you to my sponsor, Amiga MMA Jiu-Jitsu in 6 Down Street, Collingwood. So good to be back training now without all the restrictions, having all the members in the club. We can see each other face to face. We can roll. We can beat each other up. No, we don't beat each other up. We're a very friendly club. But for those of you who want to come down, check us out, please do. George Soteropoulos, my coach, former UFC guy, did extremely well for himself. A wonderful coach, a great teacher, a great individual. And we're female friendly. We're kid friendly. We're a family club. We want people to come down, have fun, have a good time. You know, whether you want to be fit, whether you want to be an elite fighter, we can cut a few down at Amiga MMA. So thank you to George and the gang for looking after me. Right now, I'm so delighted to be able to present a gentleman that I have a wish list on this podcast. I guess a bucket list of people that I've wanted to chat with, and this individual was on my list. And it took a little while for him to come on. Obviously, he's a very busy man, and but I'm so delighted to be able to welcome Joe Barresi on the podcast. Joe, it's an honor to have you. Thank you so much for your time and availing yourself, considering that you don't know me, but here we are.
Well, I had a nice conversation with you already, and I enjoyed the podcast that I watched already, and thank you for having me and bearing with my schedule, Tony. Thank you so much.
No, it's a pleasure, man. I understand that, you know, of all the people I've had on the podcast, I appreciate that everyone is busy and they have schedules and that they have their life and business to lead. And I understand exactly where I sit on the food chain. So the fact that anyone will have time with me, it's very humbling. And again, thank you very much for being here. Joe, so just to the start, I'm just going to let you know and the listeners know who or viewers. We're not going to be talking about what mic you used on this album. This is not going to be a tutorial-based podcast. I think that there's plenty of you online talking about technique and workflow and stuff. And I think for myself and those who do watch or listen to the podcast, really we're just interested in you and your story and how you got started. So why don't we just start there where, you know, what was it like growing up as a kid? What were your early, you know, when did music first become something that really struck you, you know, where you felt the magic of music? And was there a moment where you said, I want to make a career out of this, or you know, or is it something that you fell into? So just give us a bit of an idea as to Joe Jr.
Well, I grew up in Staten Island, New York, which is one of the boroughs, but not the most popular boroughs. And my earliest memory of music is my grandmother's porch, and just one of those like lawn chairs sitting out on our porch, and the AM radio going the whole time, and just these songs coming on, and just you know, absorbing all the information, the melodies and the chords, and how amazing it sounded coming out of a tiny, crappy little speaker. And that and how much I enjoyed music then. It really was, you know, just what is music, and 70s, basically 70s music still has a really warm place in my heart. So somewhere around, I guess at that point I started, you know, watch the Partridge Family. You see Keith Partridge. He's a very attractive man playing guitar, singing good songs. He's able to pick up girls. They're all falling in love with his adoring fans. You know, they love him. So if there's something that clicked there that made me want to start playing guitar. Mm-hmm. And I actually got an acoustic guitar, nylon string, when I was 7 years old. And then I just started, you know, playing and messing around, learning everything that I could. And then at some point I moved from New York to Florida, and that's sort of where my formative years came along. There's a guy named Mike Little who lived in my neighborhood. He was like the one guy that took you under his wing that was a couple years older, and he listened to Pat Travers and Jimi Hendrix and Al Di Meola, and he turned me on to all the heavyweights. And, you know, at the time I'd been listening to mostly the Beatles, and then all of a sudden this technique guy came in, and actually very so then I ended up moving back to New York, and Van Halen was like, this is first Van Halen record, second Van Halen record, watching guys get off the bus stop carrying their guitars, just wondering what's going on here. What are they doing? Following down to a building down the street where there's a rehearsal studio, and just giving some guitar lessons at that point, playing in bands, and then moving back to Florida and basically being bringing my friend's gear to a recording studio, an 8-track recording studio, and just at that point having been through so many bands and realized how crazy it is to try to keep 4 or 5 people in the same group together and the same focus together, and then sitting on the other side of the glass and hearing a guy recording music and making suggestions. That was the light, that just the bulb that went off in my head. Well, I can still be artistic and creative and not have to deal with the singer, basically, or the drummer or whoever. And so after that, I ended up I went to University of South Florida for a bit just to study music. And I really, I wanted to learn as much about music as possible. So I started taking theory classes and playing classical guitar. And at the time, because I could play like Uli Roth and Yngwie kind of stuff, super technical, but my right hand was nothing like any of the other guys' right hands, because they were super classical players. And with a pick in your right hand, it doesn't really matter, honestly. The left hand was good, but the right wasn't. So and then fast forward, what are you going to do with your life? Am I going to play in a restaurant the rest of my life, some acoustic guitar while I dress up in this really bad suit? Or am I going to try to do something else? And my guitar teacher was a guy named Joe Barresi at the time, who was possibly the greatest guitar player I've ever dealt with in my life. And he turned
What
me
made
on
him?
to.
What made him so great? What I mean, you've dealt with a lot of guitar players, so I'm intrigued. What made him so great?
He could play anything. He could listen to a rock song and transcribe it and show me how to play, Chicago, Color My World, or show me how to play whatever was on the radio, and then play like Recuerdos de la Alhambra. It's just amazing classical guitar stuff and just jazz. He knew everything about every style. He turned me on to Pat Martino. He turned me on to Phil Keaggy and all these incredible heavyweight guitar players in so random genres of music. So I think he was kind of in cahoots with my dad, because they were trying to give me an education at the same time. So he he said down at the University of Miami, there was a classical guitar teacher named Juan Mercadal, who was just a phenomenal classical guitarist. And I put my cassette tape up and learned how to play Randy Rhoads D, which is the most classical sounding, metal dude playing classical guitar. And that was my audition tape. I got accepted in, and then went down to Miami, took a couple years of theory, ear training, pretty broad education, actually. A lot of musical history, music business, communication, so many different kinds of classes, a lot of on hands recording orchestras and bands, and not necessarily taught by the school, but the opportunity to go and work in the studio at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would go to school all day and then work all night, just absorb as much as I could. And then at some point, fast forward a little more, came out for an AES show in LA and fell in love with LA and the radio out here and the energy and the bands, and decided I was just going to move. And that was it.
Wow.
And here I
am. You mentioned something before about your dad and your guitar teacher being in cahoots about education. One thing that I certainly experienced as a youngster was a lot of resistance. My dad was, let's just say, a failed academic, bless him, but very, very smart guy. Didn't reach the the heights he wanted to, and vicariously lived through me, and was hoping for me to become a lawyer. And of course, all his hopes were dashed, because as a youngster, I wanted to do music and rebelled very hard. So was your dad supportive in you in terms of looking towards a career in music, or did he see it more as a hobby and you had to get yourself some kind of a real job or career?
I think in the beginning stages, all your parents always wish the best. My parents, my dad, I don't even think went near college, and he graduated high school later on. He had a family to support in that era, just 6 brothers and sisters, and my grandmother. So they had a business together. So he never graduated high school till way later.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they always wanted something better for you, but he could see that I could do both. I was actually going to school and doing fairly well, and it was never one or the other. I rebelled, but it wasn't to the point where I knew the education was as long as I could. Basically, it was Tom Schultz from Boston, I think, that kind of clarified it all for me. Where I thought, here's a guy that went to MIT,
Yeah.
who was in this band Boston, who played guitar, wrote songs, had a recording studio in his basement, and was also working on the Polaroid one-step camera. So
Yeah.
I think it justified the fact that you could be an MIT graduate and have a great rock band at the same time. So that was a turning point in my life. That was 1976 or so.
Yeah.
That record came out. There was a huge
That was
influence on.
Wasn't it amazing? I remember when I first got that album. In one of the liner notes, it said that there were no synthesizers on that record,
Yeah.
or everything was
Yeah.
just done with guitars and with his own effects and it's obviously technique in playing. And
And
Boston
designs.
Oh man! Because he had the Rockman, right? He released that little.
He had the Power Soak. He was working on the Rockman. He later on, I read that he invented some kind of thing that would take a snapshot of his guitar sound, like basically like an EQ match. Like today, is so easy to do with the plugin, but he would record and then match the guitar sound months later when he was actually working on another song or had to punch in or change a part, and it's just mind blowing to me that part of it is also that there was mystery back then.
Oh
Now
yeah.
everything is kind of like laid out in the studio. Everybody's documenting everything, and there's this aura of mystery that went on back then that you made you want to read Guitar Player magazine, which I still religiously read everything I can get my hands on that has to do with both music and not music. It's just education in general.
I agree with you on that. In terms of the wonder that you experience when you listen to things pre-internet, where you just the mystery behind it. I think my first memory of being mesmerized by music was listening to my dad's reel to reel, and he had. I'm sure it was a dodgy recording because it came from Singapore. It's just like in '69, I think it was listening to Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys and listening to God Only Knows. And I was just like,
Wow.
as a child, just so mesmerized by it. And later on, as I really started getting into collecting and music, my fascination was always about panning. I thought, how the hell did I get it from here to there? And when someone said, well, it's just a pan.
Eddie Kramer.
Yeah.
I listen to Eddie Kramer stuff and I just go, man, he is the master of that.
So yeah, and yes, you said today it's all kind of laid out for you, and a little bit of that mystery does go away. But I'm glad I had those moments as a child because they remain with me, and I appreciate that that we got through there. So you're in LA, you're living it up. It's the 80s now, yeah.
It's So I left Miami 1988.
Yeah.
So I was in Tampa and Miami, and I came out here in '88, and I really wanted to be an assistant engineer at a studio. So I this thing called a Thomas Guide, pre-internet. It was a map, and you basically go in and you look at, you had magazines, recording magazines, like Mix Magazine would at some point put out the directory of studios in California. And you'd look up LA and you'd jot down every studio and it would list a phone number and an address and a manager and maybe the console that they used or how many rooms are there. So I made these huge lists and I used the Thomas Guide to map out 50 or so studios. And then in 2 days, I dropped off 35, 40 resumes. And there's a very famous studio called Cherokee.
Yep.
That actually offered me a job, but not as an assistant engineer. They offered me a job as a tech helper because they had a bunch of Trident A-range. Actually, it was a 4-room facility, and 3 of the rooms had A-range consoles, and there's only 13 A-ranges in the world. Wow. They had 3 of them and 1 custom A-range. So they were remaking this custom A range as a module that you could buy. It was like one of the first rack mount mic pre EQs I've ever seen in my life, and I could solder. So they hired me to do that. But there was a point one day where I think every assistant quit because they were basically on salary and getting paid, a small amount of money to work 100 hours a week. So I think they all boycotted one day or something and didn't come in. And then it was a bunch of sessions. So I wanted to be the assistant, and they wouldn't allow me in the studio because I hadn't gone through the training program or whatever, some jive. So I'd been repairing guitars at night as well. I would work from say 9 to 5, but I would go to work at 7 in the morning and work for free from 7 to 9 to hang out with the actual paid techs so I can learn how to align a tape machine and how to set up a room. So my 2 hours of free labor, and then at night I would go to a guitar store and just repair guitars because I was a tinkerer, as they say, and I could take apart my guitars and stuff. So I'd been doing that. I quit Cherokee, just started doing guitars, and my roommate at the time, my 2 roommates, one of them I went to school with, was working at Sound City, and he was he didn't really want to be an assistant engineer. He wanted to be in a band, so he worked at the front desk, and he had called me up and said the remote for the tape machine is broken, so we need someone to stand by the tape machine and be a tape op, literally a real tape op. Hit rewind, punch in.
Yep, been there.
you know what I'm talking about.
Oh yeah.
So they threw me in the deep end. I took the gig. I went over there and I was a tape op at Sound City, and that became my into Sound City, which was a 2-room facility at the time. Has always been really a 2-room facility, but there was 2 old Neve consoles in there. So, but there was never enough work as an employee. So I ended up I wanted to learn how to use an SSL. I took a class at USC, and the professor was a guy named Dick McGilvery, who had a studio in Pasadena called Sound Chamber. And we hit it off. He was a really good teacher, and he hired me to work at his studio. So I would do part-time there, part-time at Sound City. Found another job in an overdub place called Preferred Sound. They had a sister studio called Pacific. So between the 4 of them, I could kind of track at Sound City with the band, try to convince them to go to Preferred Sound or Pacific to do overdubs, and then go to Pacific or wherever to mix. And I would, it was kind of a primitive way of gathering clients as well, because I was with these people for a long time, going studio to studio. And it also allowed me to learn different desks, different rooms. I could also, check out different clients. Some like the Sound Chamber studio was more like Mark Isham and David Torn, which was incredible to watch those guys play and record music. But I grew up in a kind of hard rock era, so there wasn't a whole lot of rock going on there. And Sound City was the epitome of rock and roll. So that really was my favorite place to work at.
And off you went and did your thing. Wow. What do you remember in terms of as a youngster? The things that the good, what were the great lessons you learned, you think, as an assistant and a youngster, that have held you in good stead moving on, as a freelancer?
Well, I think, honestly, some days I wish I could go back and assist, because when you're assisting in a session, you're so focused on making sure the engineer is doing his, as everything is working to his satisfaction. You're making sure that the headphones are working on the drummer. If somebody mentions they need a drink, you're grabbing a water or a Coke or something. You're making sure the food order is right. You're making sure the phone messages come in and they're addressed to the right person. You're making sure the producer's involved. And so it's basically like being a cruise director. But a lot of times I wasn't able to sit between speakers with like, a heavyweight engineer and go, wow, what are you actually hearing? How are you EQing that kick drum? You would kind of do those things after the client left or while there was a break or whatever. So I really do. And I also think that until you actually do it yourself, like until I actually started freelancing in engineering, I didn't really know how to record. I've seen many people record, but seeing and doing are 2 different things. So once you dip your toes in the water and you kind of do stuff, it's kind of nice to be able to go back and watch somebody else do it again, which is really tough these days because there's a whole separation of the control these days. I mean, when we were working at Sound City, it was amazing. You walk in the lounge and see Tom Petty, or you walk down the hallway and there's Brett Gurewitz from Bad Religion, and you hear a guitar sound coming out of another room, and you ask the guitar player what he's playing through, and there's this camaraderie and this whole competition as well. What are you doing in there? What kind of pedals are you know what I mean? And you would wait till they left at night so you can peek in and see what they're doing,
Yeah.
or you could just ask, and people are very, like we're doing, disclosing information. But the fact that you would see that kind of stuff in the same building was very there's also good competition between bands back then.
Mm.
These guys are in the next room, let's blast them out, let's see what they're
Yeah.
doing, where our stuff
Yeah.
is way heavier, so me growing up, the thing I learned early on was, if you agree to do it, and do it 100%. There is no, you're paying me half rate, I'm going to work half as hard. I'm going to do this and I'm going to do it right. Paying attention is a huge thing. I mean, I've been in sessions where the assistant's been sitting in the back reading a newspaper, and the drummer is having problems with his headphones in the middle of a take, and I have to like get up and scream at somebody to go over and do it, as opposed to that's your job. If you can't bother being there, why would I ever take you with me somewhere else or recommend you for a gig? There's, as a runner in different studios, I can remember so many stories where there'd be a plunger, a toilet plunger in front of the sink in the bathroom on the floor. And I would just leave it there because I thought, well, I'm the client. I'm just going to leave it and see how many days this takes to actually get removed by the person who's in charge of cleaning the toilet. And it wouldn't get removed until I go grab him by the head and bring him over there and say, look, is this in your bathroom in your house? Is there, you know what I mean? Like, so if you can't do these basic jobs, how are you going to be in charge of organizing Barbra Streisand's vocals, or tuning this person's vocal, or whatever, or documenting a guitar amp, or putting a microphone on a stand, or whatever,
Yeah.
So my real advice was really always to do 100%, whatever it is.
Yeah. And for me as a youngster, one of the things I learned a lot through I mean, I know you said before that watching is one thing, doing is another, but for me, what observation taught me was looking at patterns of engineers, workflow, what they were doing, interaction with clients, studio craft, studio etiquette, the importance of just being in the corner and shutting your mouth. But, when you could see, where you could see something and you kind of could predict that this is what's going to happen, to then maybe take an initiative to go in and do something, which I thought, well, if I can do that, that's going to make the engineer's job easier. But I just had to kind of wait and anticipate it. But again, just through observation. But also for me, the great learning was communication between engineer and client, and just studio etiquette. And one of the things I find when I get young guys who come through here, and the odd girl that comes through here as well, is a lot of kids now are very au fait when it comes to the tech and the theory. In fact, they probably know a lot of me. I'm the least technical person on the planet, Joe. I have no disgrace in shame in saying that. But
only it comes. You need your ears. You don't have to know how things work.
Well,
in the end.
Yeah, it was a big part of my imposter syndrome for so long because I didn't go through the system through the traditional method of an internship and assistant, and I just went to a lot of studios and I learned from a lot of engineers, and then I just said I'm going to try and give this a go myself. But the point I was going to make is that what I noticed lacking, and I don't know if it's anybody's fault really, but what's lacking is the lack of initiative. I think fundamentally, and I'm not having a go at kids because I love kids. My kids are my world, and I love mentoring them. But almost a sense of entitlement. I think because they're spoiled. When you and I were growing up, in order to get to new music, searching new music, for example, was an effort to get to the record store and flick through the records, or get a magazine to read about a studio, an engineer, or a guitar amp, or what have you. Whereas now, with the magic of a handheld device, everything is at your disposal, and so that effort and drive to find and seek information isn't. And as I said, that's not their fault. That's the world that they're brought up in. But for me, any kid that's come through here and spent any amount of time usually were not the ones who had the highest marks at school, or in fact even had a degree. It was the kids who showed the most initiative, the most drive, punctuality, basic manners, and things like that.
Yeah.
And the rest of it, I thought, well, they've got that down. Then the other stuff will sort of come to them because they're willing and they're malleable. Not to manipulate them, but they're open. And it's so much easier when they come to you and they're open and they're willing and they're listening and they'll do the work. And they're not going to try and argue with you and tell you, well, my lecturer said this and my lecturer said that. It's just like, oh, please.
Yeah. All right. I mean, the thing about school, I think, is it actually teaches you where to find the answer.
Mm-hmm.
So that, I mean, that's the thing to me. It's like when I started working in my own studio for many reasons, financially, it didn't make sense to keep putting my gear in storage and having to cart it to a place. And as budgets got lower, so I got my own place eventually, and I interviewed people to work for me. A lot of people wanted to be my assistant or whatever. And in this day and age, I remember just sitting down with 18 different people, meet them for a coffee and grill them like, so who's your favorite artist? Okay, it's this band. So what album of theirs did you enjoy? Well, I don't really know any albums. I know the song. Okay, well, where was this? Which out? Where was it recorded? I have no idea. Who produced it? I have no idea. And all these questions that were completely obvious to me growing up, because you were like, why does Deep Purple sound so good? Well, Martin Birch's name is on here. Okay, that's pretty interesting. And it was done at the studio. And then you knew everything that was done at Rockfield, and knew everything that was done at Musicland, and you knew every Andy Johns record because it had a certain sound. And it was only one kid out of 18 kids that actually could say, I like this band, and they've recorded at that studio. And there's a few rooms at that studio, but they probably recorded in Studio C because there was a Trident desk, and it has that kind of flavor of Queen, which was, you know what I mean? Like, like someone who really went deep to figure out why he liked stuff. And that was the person. At the time, I didn't need somebody, but that's when I got on the phone and called a very big studio in LA and said, you should hire this guy.
Yeah.
And if you can't be bothered now on the internet, it's so easy. I mean, I love the fact that I can ask for a schematic for an NTP compressor and a million people will chime in.
Yeah.
The internet is so easy to figure this out. If you can't figure out, who recorded an album or where it was done, then you don't have that kind of desire in my mind to actually want to know these things.
Absolutely. I find also with kids, when they, as I said, in this day and age, they can have direct contact. Back as a kid, I had to write a letter to get over to get somewhere. Whereas now everything's online, and what I've noticed is a lack of preparation, lack of research when you ask the questions to find out. And kids say, "I'm really into mastering." Okay, cool. And most of them, this is what they want. They think this is what they think you want to hear from them. And again, as like you ask them a whole series of questions that will determine if you really are into it or not. And 9 times out of 10, they're not into it. So you still get hit up a lot today for people that want to come and shadow you or assist you or be your PA.
All the time, yeah. And I'm willing to help everybody, but there's occasions where you have bands that are, sometimes bands don't want people around. When I started working on Soundgarden, I got a call from the manager and they said, just you and Chris for right now. And I'm like, that's fine. I have a dog. I walk the dog. Chris can hang out. And for the first week or two, it's just Chris and I getting to know each other to see if we could work together. And it was comfortable. And I get that. And it's almost like being in a marriage, where you're going to spend a lot of time together in a room, and you're going to need to trust the other person. So, and then, after a couple of days on, actually, it was like, hey, I have an assistant who can facilitate, no problem. And then, so a lot of times you can't really have somebody shadowing.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I just read that Ted Templeman book, and they're talking about having people in a control room watching people do stuff, and coming in and listening, and it's just there's a whole different world back then. I think it was a lot looser, where you can walk in and check out somebody recording.
Yeah.
But nowadays, I think people are a little more self-conscious, maybe. And
Yeah. I think also maybe in the world, because of the fact that people can, this is a theory of mine anyway, that because of the digital era, people now can record stuff, and maybe, as far as protecting intellectual property, they just don't want things to be out.
yeah,
People just
yeah,
want,
that's true. A big part of it too.
they want their confidentiality, and they got a certain marketing scheme or whatever. They want to do it on their terms to create the impact that they want to create, or the mystique around the product, or what or what have you. So tell me, how did you go from engineering into production? Was that something that seemed like a natural progression for you, or again, was there a moment where you thought, you know what, I want to put on a producer's hat and have a go at doing that?
Well, to go from assisting to engineering was a fairly simple. Uh,
Transition?
because a lot of times when you're assistant in a house studio, you're kind of getting the sounds anyway. You know where everything's at. You know what you've seen come through there. You know where to set the drums up because everybody that's come through does it there. And you might experiment a little on your own time and do it differently, but for the most part, you know at least where to start. And so my jump from assisting engineering was fairly straightforward. And engineering, honestly, is a very lucrative at the time. You get paid by the day. So if a record takes 14 days or 14 months, it doesn't really matter. But there is a point where you're kind of, you're working on stuff that, for me, I've always had trouble working on stuff that I don't like, and not necessarily um, that I don't like it. It's just not. It's just more of a, you know, I've never been that well. I can't say I've never been that difficult, but having a little more control. Basically,
Yeah.
engineering is like, okay, do you like the sound? Okay, great. And then you kind of have to lay back. And even though you're working with a producer maybe that doesn't understand if a guitar is in tune or in time, you kind of make suggestions. So I thought I was producing anyway. So making the jump though from engineer to producer, really comes down to a lot. Back at that point in my career, it came down to credits. I mean, when you buy an album, you say, okay, we love this album. Who produced it? This person.
Yeah.
Or who mixed it? No one cared who the engineer was.
Mm.
So, and in my opinion, the engineer was the guy or the girl, whatever, who made the sound of the band at that point, captured it. And there's many records that I worked on where 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 10 days, where here it is. And then somebody mixed it, and they're do it in 2 days or 6 days. And they've got 10 times the amount of money you got. Plus they've got points, record sells 1,000,000 copies before you know it. And to me, it just wasn't that fair. So I thought I would like to be the mixer and the producer, because this sounded great when I left,
Yeah.
and now it's not quite how I thought it would be. So
Mm.
it was actually a guy named Ulrich Wild who worked for Terry Date, who I loved all the Terry Date records.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Ulrich was his engineer, and then all of a sudden Ulrich was producing his own records. And I remember asking him one day, I go, how do you make the jump? And he basically said, quit taking engineering gigs. So if you want to produce, you have to be willing not to engineer.
Yeah.
So it made a lot of sense to me. I said, well, I can get paid this crazy amount of money every day to engineer, but I'm going to not do it. I'm just going to work on stuff and get an additional production or whatever. And it's sort of the same thing in mixing. I mean, you start making rough mixes, and the band all of a sudden likes the rough better than the person that they just paid a bunch of money to. And
Mm.
so it just kind of, to me, it was a natural progression. But I always say it's like going to Vegas. You're just pulling on a slot machine. Am I going to win this, or am I going to lose it? And you have to be willing to sit at home and not take that job that was 6 weeks worth of work. And just because I mean, for me, the Queens of the Stone Age was one of those things where I could have got paid an insane amount of money to work on some music that I didn't know because the producer wouldn't play it for me, but could have been big, but who knows? Because he got offended that I didn't like his, judgment of music or whatever. I basically, wanted to hear the music before, and it just didn't work out. So Josh Homme called me and said, I've got this band. They didn't even have a name. It was just him and the drummer from Caius. And it turned into Queens of the Stone Age. And for me, going out to the desert and doing that in 17 days was a way cooler thing than working 6 weeks on something that I had no idea what it was for 10 times the amount of money that I made. But it was with my friends, and it was music that I enjoyed. I mean, he sent me a cassette tape, and I put it on, and Mexicola was the first song I heard. I was like, whoa, this is amazing sounding. It's just the next level stuff, And so I was in, man. You do it for the right reason. Anytime I've done stuff for money 3 or 4 times in my life, and every time it's bit me in the ass.
Yeah.
Every single time. So
Yeah.
it's not really the factor anymore.
Yeah, I think, and I think for any young kids, I think also it's important to find the things that you love and don't just think about the money. Money, I think, just seems to be the automatic consequence of what happens when you learn how to bring value to people and to bands. And if you're into something, it's like you can't bullshit a bullshitter, Joe. People know when you're feeling it and when you're not feeling it. So, when you're in a session and you're vibing on what you're doing, you're going to be putting all of your effort into it. And the more effort, the more repetition, the better you get at something, the more skilled you get. And people will start beating the drums about you. And sure enough, through word of mouth, people will come. It's the old adage of the 20-year overnight sensation. But again, but
I mean, to me, it was always 100. I mean, even when somebody asked your opinion, okay, so there has to be a little bit of politics in there. You can't just go, yeah, that's the worst vocal I've ever heard in my life. But you point out the good stuff and you try to make it better. Like, hey, maybe it's just a little flat right there.
Yeah.
Can I adjust the headphones a little for you to make sure he's hearing the right pitch? Or maybe there's too much bass, so he can't pitch to it. Or I mean, you know what I mean? Like those positive suggestions come back way more important than when somebody did ask your opinion. But I'm also not the guy to lie to you at all. I'm very New York in that way.
Yeah.
Adam Jones from Tool always says that I'm like the most brutally honest. Like he's just like, if you don't like it, you don't like it, and I'll gladly tell you that I don't like it. I think you could do better, or this is the wrong sound, or whatever. It's just I've always been that way. It's just
that's what I noticed in New York too. It's New York is pretty straight up, and where you stand, which I think is preferable to LA is a little bit more. It's all smiles and whatever, but you sometimes you don't really know what you're reading between or behind the lines. But New York, I think what's that joke where in New York, fuck you means hello, how are you in LA. Hello means fuck you.
Oh yeah, here I always used to say if I say your shit to your face in New York, but here they wait till you turn around and walk away before they say your shit. It's like that. It's just I don't see any advantage. I mean, when you're in an album and it's like you're trying to do the best you can for the whole situation, and there's a lot. The thing that you realize later on, I was reading self-help books, motivational books, anything that I could do to make the situation in the studio more positive. It wasn't the weed dealer.
Yeah.
I was the guy that was like, I remember hearing Jason Casaro, who was a mentor, telling me about.
Oh, bless him. Oh, rest in peace. Yeah. What a great guy he was. Yeah.
He was. He told me when they were working on Super Unknown that they brought in some furniture from Kim Thayil's living room, and he would play solos in his living room basically because he was used to practicing guitar sitting on his couch. I never asked Kim if that was true or not, but just the idea of that making it comfortable, that was the sessions that were the most comfortable were the beauty of Sound City. I mean, Sound City was like a rehearsal room.
Yeah.
You didn't walk in thinking, oh my God, I'm spending a ton of money today. I'm afraid to put my drink down on the table because I might tarnish the, you know what I mean? It was really when you take the thought out of it, then the art comes out.
Yeah.
If you're concerned about any of the, the little stuff that doesn't matter in a studio, that's why I think that's why Sound City was such a great room, and you walk into it and you want to create because it feels like it, as opposed to some of the classier places that cost twice as much money.
Yeah, sometimes some places they can look particularly schmick, and they can be a little intimidating. I think, especially to a young, and in this environment too. Now it's so much more independent releases and self-financed projects. I think people like the idea of the wow factor, but if people can't, George Augsburger, when he designed and tuned these rooms, he he told me this really good thing that stuck with me, and he said you need your rooms to perform like a control room, but feel like a lounge room and feel comfortable. So when the client comes in, they're going to sit and listen to the record and enjoy it as Johnny Punch Clock would hear it, at home. Obviously,
Exactly.
they don't have the great room acoustic, but still, they're still listening to final product. And when they go home and hit play, it's what the punters are going to listen to. But they don't want to feel intimidated, but you want the room to give you a relatively accurate representation of what's going on, so that it'll translate. Which it takes me to this question, because this is obviously it's called Mastering Music, Mastering Life, and I speak to a lot of mastering engineers, but I'm also fascinated to speak to other engineers about their experience with mastering, their views on mastering, where they see it today. Are there? And again, I'm not going to make you tell me who you like, more than anyone else. But if
Well,
if
I
there are
can tell
engineers
you.
that you respect, or I'm just curious to get your take on how you see mastering evolve over, since you've been involved in music, where you see it today, and are there any, and if there are any, guys that you particularly respect and you want to tell us about, I'm keen to hear about your thoughts on that.
So mastering to me was always like a mystery until I actually started mixing records and was able to go to mastering or ask if I could go. Even when I was engineering records, I would ask if I can go to mastering, and no one really cared back then. And to me, I mean, it was an art for sure. I was actually talking about this the other day to somebody on mastering some of the Kaya stuff with Eddie Schreier, and it was like a performance. There's two sides of a console, and he'd listen to the album when we'd hand a 14-inch reel that we had edited together, and this side A and here's side B, and we'd sit back in a room and have listening sessions and decide we need a little more space between here, a little less space, change the sequence around. It was really a listening experience because there was still a lot of vinyl then. And then the mastering engineer would actually listen to the whole album and make notes and then do it. I mean, at that point, song one on the left side of the desk, song two, crossfade between the two. I never forgot Eddie Schreier kind of dancing behind the console and just performing these moves. And there was nothing crucial or anal about it at all. It was very Neanderthal in a way. Here's the EQ, and here's the EQ, here's a crossfade, and if something got messed up, you would edit it or go in and punch it in or whatever. But there was never this micromanaging quarter dBs of stuff here and there. So mastering to me, those like like I personally don't like to master my own stuff, even though some people have asked. It's just, to me, it's a different hat. It's just, mixing is already hard enough, listening to that many tracks and getting it down to a stereo image, and then I personally don't think I'm very good at making mixes similar. Like, a song is a song to me. I don't care if this one's a little dark, this one's a little bright. You can kind of even them out a little later. And if not, then maybe they just needed to be a dark and a bright song. Who cares? I mean, there's a style. But there is a certain confidence that a mastering engineer should bring to the table. And to me, Bob Ludwig is the end all guy. He is, he's the guy that when you give him something, this person he's adopted it like as his own child.
Yeah.
When I did 10,000 days and spent 2 days with him, and got on a plane and came home, and he had an email with he was listening back to the album and commenting, there's, the vocal in this area as a, third party listener seems a little obscure. Is there a vocal up? Do you think we can cut in here? Or maybe it's a little too sibilant here. Do you mind if I do this? Or there's a pop over here in this speaker. And it was very detailed and very very careful. I know now he listens to when, do mastered for iTunes stuff. He'll do it at a couple different levels to see what it sounds like.
Yeah.
And he's the end all to me. He's the one guy where I just know, okay, I can call him and go, hey, Bob, I had some problems with this, and this is what we were listening to. And this is sort of what we're going for. I might not have achieved it. And usually it comes back just like, where you're just going, well, did you remix it as well as remaster it, or what did you do up there? It's amazing. So I'm going to just say that he's the one. I mean, all the records those years that I've listened to, also everything was at the time Master Disc and Bob Ludwig, and Howie Weinberg was very instrumental in a lot of the early stuff. Him and Jason had a great run, and Howie and hung out with Greg Calby a couple times. He's really great. I was actually just saw a friend of mine, Todd Sullivan, who was at Geffen at the time when I was working with Weezer, and remember going to see George Marino at Sterling at one point. And he was another one, rest his soul, man. He would like, that's my dog. He would look at me and just go, he would say, this one is perfect. I don't need to do anything to it. And then the next song he would EQ like some crazy stuff. And I always thought like, is it really perfect, or you just can't fix it? You know what I mean? Like, but I thought he was great too. And, and then there's, sometimes you just don't have the money to afford the heavyweights, and you have to go with guys that, are
a little bit more price range
side will take.
Yeah. Do you know, maybe you know this, but did you know that George Marino's nickname at Sterling was the Pope? I didn't know that. Chris Athens told me they used to call, and the reason they called him that was because he just never had a bad word to say about anyone. He was just, he was just such a sweetheart and such a nice guy. And I always remember him. He was
quiet.
Yeah, really chill, really chilled, really laid back, and he again, just one of those many guys who gave me the time of day where he didn't need to, and was very encouraging. And just gone too soon was George. How much choice do you have these days in selecting an engineer? Do record companies generally, do you find, have people in mind, or do they take any input from you?
I'm pretty adamant about using the people I want to use. I mean, I get your budget is wide, so if you don't have the Bob Ludwig budget, I mean, there is a point where at this point I would just probably fork it over myself, But there is a guy that I used to use quite a bit, and I'm not going to mention any names here, who would do lower budget stuff, but I can tell you what I didn't like about it. And it was great for a long time, but in the end, I mean, in these days, I'm basically handing off a mastering engineer a sequence in Pro Tools. It can be an MP3, it could be anything, and I've already sequenced. I really love sequencing.
Yeah,
it's part of the thing where I'll put the songs together and do my own version, and the band will have an idea of their version, and I'll modify mine and theirs together or whatever, until to me it's much more cost effective to hand somebody the sequence, the crossfades, roughly. Obviously it changes a little once it's actually mastered, but
sure.
I mean, if there's 10 songs on an album and you're listening back to the mastered reference and the same song is on there twice, then the mastering engineer is not really paying that much attention.
Yeah,
especially if one of them starts with drums and one of them starts with guitar. I mean, you're obviously not matching the waveforms. I've gotten stuff back from heavyweight guys where the vocals are ahead of the band. I'm like, how's this even possible? And it turns out that they're mastering the instrumental mix as loud as they possibly could, and then they would master the vocal stem and lay it on top. Only I'm not of the mentality where I'm handing a mastering engineer stem. So if a vocal's only 2 minutes long and the song is 8 minutes long, my vocal file's 2 minutes long, because I always do an acapella.
Yeah.
But it's not going to be 8 minutes long, like the song. So
Yeah.
so if you're gonna master the instrumental and then master the acapella and then
Put them on
line them
top.
up, and you're not realizing that this is completely out of whack, and then you're gonna do the vocal up and it's out of whack as well. I
Yeah.
mean, then you're obviously not paying attention. So there'll be no way we're going back to that person ever again.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, those are some of the stories that are bad news.
Yeah. I know stem mastering is a thing, and I appreciate the flexibility and the options that it can present. I've never been a fan of doing it, primarily because I feel that even if you're working with instrumental and a vocal track, it puts a level of responsibility on you to do levels on a track that really are out of my pay grade, you know, and
Right.
I feel that if there's a, yeah, it's a quasi mix, and by virtue of even listening to it over 10 times before we get a chance to start from the stereo mix, I'm already behind the 8 ball, because I remember Rick Essig, my main my first real mastering mentor, said to me, "You can only listen to a record for the first time once." And if part of my job is to try and imagine the impact that the end listener is going to receive when they hit play, that's not going to happen after I've had 20 rolls of a song. So, so just there in itself, that I'm out, and I don't disrespect. Look, I know a lot of guys who I respect do it, and they're successful at it, and they do well, and God bless them. But
it's mixing to me. I mean, bringing in a Pro Tools session with stems of everything and combining it in a mastering console. I'm like, make the decision before you go to mastering. That's the icing on the cake. It's like bringing the ingredients into your kitchen and saying, okay, we're going to make a cake, only it's going to be vanilla and it's going to have this frosting, but you got to put it all together. That's weird to me. I mean, I have the vision of what the mix should sound like. I know what the cake should taste like. I'd really like you to make it a better tasting cake by, doing your magic on top of it all. But I will never, ever master off of stems. I would never mix off of stems. I'll occasionally add something a little bit louder or take something away by flipping the phase out of it if I can. I personally don't even like making stems, but unfortunately that's one of the prerequisites these days of making records. It's more time consuming.
Do you these days, are you still, do you prefer to mix the stuff you track? Are you okay with stuff coming in from another engineer, or do you have a discussion with them to specify specifics about how you'd like things to be?
I've been involved a couple times where I've been booked a long ahead of time to mix the record, and the band will feel like it's I like to be involved in, hey, what's the track sound like, or what are you doing over there? They're usually really cool about, hey, we'd really like your opinion on this bass sound. We think it's cool, but is it, I'd rather have that than here's 16 tracks of bass and you can pick your own bass sound. So for me, but a lot of times you get stuff that runs the gamut. I've had stuff that's completely out of phase and distorted, and you're just like, and sometimes it's not the intent, but it's created a sound and you can't undo it. It's what it is. I mean, and I've had stuff that's just impeccably recorded. I prefer not to give my stuff to anybody else to mix, but and back when I was starting, it was a given. I mean, Chris Lord Alge's going to mix this, and it was given to guys that were great mixers, so I didn't have a problem with it. But there's a lot to learn from guys like that.
Oh, look, most definitely. I'm one of the well, there's a few reasons why I got into mastering, but one of them was mixing. To me was something that it overwhelmed me when I saw lots of tracks, even 8 tracks. I always was overwhelmed by it. To manage things, and I don't know whether that's my ADHD or what it was, but I felt really overwhelmed. So when mastering first came my way, and it was just like, what? There's just a left and a right channel. Cool. I don't have to worry about balancing this and that. Awesome. Plus the fact that it was quick. I know, earlier on we were talking about, being in studios. And if you if you got stuck on a record that you weren't particularly enjoying, it was brutal, to sit there. For me, listening to a kick drum for 3 hours while they pull
Yeah.
it, was. Whereas with mastering, and I love the idea that there was a quick turnover project. So even if there was a record that you weren't particularly feeling, chances were the next thing that would come along would be probably more to your liking. Plus the fact that you got a variety of stuff, But the kicker for me was when it was presented to me that, look, every man and his dog wants to be a mix engineer and a producer, because that's what I aspired to be as a youngster. I was listening to records, and like you said before, the credits, and you'd always see a producer credit, you'd see a mix credit, very, very rarely a mastering credit, if ever. And so it was just as much of a mystery to me. But when I saw the relative speed of the process compared to mixing a record and tracking a record, but the pragmatic decision came when they said, well, listen, you want to be a mix engineer? Go ahead. There's all these people out there who are willing to sell their mothers just to come and clean the ashtrays, but no one knows about this stuff, and there's a shortage, and we need people, and you'll be up and running in no time, or you can just go back there and try your luck. So I never aspired to be a rock star. I just wanted to do something I love doing, and yeah.
I find it interesting, though, that back in the day, it started cutting lacquers and working in the mastering before you became the engineer. Like at Abbey Road, you would just start in tape copy, and you'd have to learn about the standards of how to delivery of the music, and you would learn about fidelity. Like here's the high point of the recording chain, the end point, and here's the problems that happen when stuff is not recorded well or too noisy or out of phase. And then they throw you in the bottom. I think that's the way it should be. You know what I mean? So you went right to the top of the chain. To me, that's awesome. I watched, I go down to see Bernie Grundman or Chris Bellman and do some stuff at Grundman Mastering sometimes. And I just the whole idea of transferring stuff, acetates into Pro Tools and listening to what happens to an acetate or a lacquer after you've cut it, and then getting into the different kinds of needles, the elliptical nudes and
Parabolic,
else.
yeah.
And then that to me is a fascinating art as well. If I had known some of these things before, how much bottom end you could put on something. I mean, these things are out the window now, because you can pretty much do whatever you want in the digital world. But there was an art to it, and you kind of knew it by even this Ted Templeman book talking about mixing Van Halen with Don Landy, and then going to Amigo and listening to the mastering and cutting it and mastering it yourself, and then realizing you have an issue with something and maybe going back and remixing it. But when you had a 24 track or a 16 track tape, you can remix something fairly easily. When you've got a 250 track Pro Tool session, then it's not as easy to go back and punch a few things in.
Yeah, true that. I think the other thing for me for mastering was that it was one of those areas that even today it doesn't have the same prestige and profile as being a mix engineer or a record producer, and so I think that's where there were more opportunities, because everyone wanted to be a rock star in their own way, and that to me didn't matter. So even today, it still astounds me that people are still mystified and call it the black art. For years and years now, something I've laughed at. To me, it just seems like it's just a different skill set. I think personally, that the heroes, if you will, of the recording world are the mix engineers, because they have to make so many more decisions. Even on one track, is it going to be dry? Is it going to be wet? We're going to do a pre-post level, panning, gain. So already just on one track, we've got 6 or 7 different decisions, and then you multiply that out 24, 40, whatever times, and all of a sudden you got to be good. You got to be able to make decisions and be quick and be on the ball. Whereas in my world, a left and right channel, and there's only so much you can do, and you're at the mercy of the mix. And so
you're correct, but there are mastering engineers that have said to me in the past, what approach do you want? I'm like, what are you talking about? What approach? I mean, it's either going to be louder or softer, or brighter or darker, or things like that. what's it going to be? What are you going to do to it? You're not mixing it, but that there are people out there with these programs that think they're actually remixing your song. And that's what I love about Bob Ludwig. It's just, he enjoys it as music,
Yeah.
and then he does whatever needs to happen to it, but it's not like, I mean, if you're going in that deep where you're trying to do some MS stuff because the vocal's way too loud and needs to be brighter and the cymbals are crazy, I would personally call the mix engineer up and go, hey, maybe have another whack at this thing.
Yeah.
Because like doing that weird phasey stuff in the final stage is bizarre to me.
Oh, look, I totally agree with you. I really do. Tim Gillis, who used to own Blue Meanie in New Jersey, once said to me, and I love this quote. He said, as a mastering engineer, he said, you must respect the mix author. And I really like that turn of phrase. And, where it was about, just frame a picture. You don't need to repaint it. And obviously you don't always have the luxury of that. But I think it is important that having a good relationship with a mix engineer producer where you can confidently be able to, and coming from the angle of, look, I'm a team player. I'm invested. I'm the midwife trying to deliver this record, this baby, and to flag things, and because again, of the limitations of what can be done. So I've been called lazy sometimes when I've wanted to send something back or wanted to make some suggestion, but again, while there is flexibility to do certain things, I think that when you dig in too much into a certain area, you're going to create new problems in the rest of the mix, because we're here looking at the forest and not the trees. And I don't mind being called lazy. Frankly, I would rather work with someone who is open to the idea of something constructive, again, with the understanding that I'm on your team. We both want to create a great record. We're both contributing in our own way, but they're just, when you understand your limitations and you have enough humility to know where, what you can do and what you can't do, then I think you're going to have a better outcome each and every time.
I think actually, like, do you find your job even harder now with the different streaming formats? Because I remember when we used to just master for vinyl and cassette, and then at some point CDs came in, and now all of a sudden you actually had a CD master maybe and a separate vinyl master. The more CDs got sold, at some point you got rid of the vinyl master. But then now you've got the different streaming services and different plugins that play back these different codecs and what they sound like. And I personally, like, I try to listen to these when I'm mixing, but if I start making my mix decisions based on what it's going to sound like on Spotify or on iTunes, or YouTube, I can't do it. I just want to deliver the best possible mix of the song. And I think, like, something Bob Ludwig said to me, where he would do it at a couple different levels and listen to it and to see how it would handle the extra compression or the whatever, the transmission of these different streaming services. And in the end, to me, a good song is a good song. I don't care if it's an MP3 or a 96 bit WAV file, a 96K 24-bit WAV file. It doesn't matter to me.
Yeah. Well, I think also from a mastering perspective, translation is very important. I think for vinyl, there are certain, because of being a mechanical, medium, and there's physics at play and certain consequences that you've got to keep an eye on. And I get that in terms of optimizing it for that format. But I remember back in the 90s, there was this whole thing around mastering for radio and engineers that were marketing themselves as the guys that would, which, I guess really what was more compression and more top end. But again, I've had a lot of years experience in radio in the 90s. And one of the things I got to know the techs, and one of the things they told me that the output of the stations are in a state of flux, because they're always trying to compete, again, loudness with other stations, and they're doing a lot of compression and multiband compression and whatnot. And so I thought, like you said before, why are you going to try and second guess how a certain station is going to sound? Why don't you just make it sound good? And if there are certain limitations within the playback system, well, so be it. But at least it'll play well in a car, on a laptop, and on your phone, on a big club system, on the radio. Because all radio stations sound different. I mean, they're
Yeah.
constantly tweaking. So again, it's a moving target. So it creates a stress. And so rather just concentrate on making the shit sound good, and everything else will kind of take care of itself. And I think streaming is a similar kind of thing. There's so much debate online. Different engineers have got different points of view. You know, guys who I respect their points of view, but I'm not going to sit here with codecs and try and second guess it, man. I'm going to make it sound good. If my client's happy, just it'll take care of itself.
Exactly. I'll download it and listen to a CD, drive around in a car, make sure nothing's freaked out. You know, to me, it's just, does it translate on? I mean, I'm already mixing it on a dozen set of speakers anyway, from fairly good size to fairly tiny, and then headphones. And, you know, the one thing I will say I've modified is my hard left right panning these days. When something is singular, like a single guitar coming in headphones, it's a little bizarre, pulls you to one side. But in speakers, it never bothered me, because obviously hard left in the speaker, you're still getting some in your right ear. So I'll pan it a little bit closer in, but for the most part, I mean, to me, it's still the big picture you're listening to. And and when you stop thinking about the sound and the placement and the panning, I never heard anything on Beatles records other than good songs. You know, that was it. I would never analyze John Lennon's vocal being distorted in this section, or that's something being out of tune or whatever. It was a great song. That's as a mixer, I think you try to achieve, like you said, you try to bring some excitement to the picture, and just your first impression of it, and is it gonna move somebody? That's it, really. In the end, who cares what it sounds like?
Yeah. Well, I remember years ago there was online these various Pro Tools sessions, which were transfers essentially of just well-known records, some 4 tracks, some 8 track, and you know, listening to some of these, and if I'm assuming that they were exactly as they were off the tape without any interference, quite often you'd solo things and you would hear discrepancies or little buzzes or and it was the sum of all of those little things that were wrong that created the magic. Whereas, you know, today it was become so quantum level precision, and where the vibe is completely, well, not completely lost, but it gets lost. And when people talk about, you know, what is that made the 70s records and 80s so magical? Well, part of it was the imperfection, you know?
Well, the medium was tape machine, so you couldn't really look at it. I mean, you saw things were recording, but you couldn't see that a kick drum was like, you know, a millisecond ahead of this other. So you record with your ears and you listen, and then like if the bass was a little behind and the guitar was ahead, you had this downbeat that was massive. And nowadays, I think you kind of look into, well, this can't be correct, so I'm going to push the bass here, and I got to do this here. And half the time you listen to records, those old sessions like that, and the bass is a direct only. You know, I mean, and if you hear it, it's like super bright and crazy sounding. But when you throw it in with the drums and the guitar, it sounds like it has great low end, because it's not competing in that section. So there's I mean, to me, the sum of the parts, you said it too, is down to a band. I've recorded so many bands where there may be one great player in the band and 3 not so great players. And the first thing that somebody might say is, we got to replace the not so great players. But it's that some of the parts that makes it have that feel and that swing that makes it the music that it is. I mean, many examples in my life where there's been someone swapped out for whatever reason, and you know, it's never really better. It's just maybe a little more technical, a little more sterile in general. I mean, so it really comes down to using your ears and not being an engine eye. That's what we always say, engineer or an engine eye. It's, you know, staring at the screen. Yeah, maybe that is. I mean, you would edit back then. You get your tape out, you'd cut it. Like when we're doing Tool records, somebody commented that it sounds like he's quantized. I'm like, you don't even know what a good drummer sounds like, because there's no quantizing going on. This is a tape machine with a human being who can play drums like nobody's business. And there's no fixing this guy. You're just cutting the best stuff together if you have to. Which, you know, you do a couple passes and you might cut a verse in. You're not cutting every single kick drum and lining it up with elastic audio. I mean, that's if you got to do that, and I've done that in the past, believe me,
No
I don't
doubt.
want to do that ever.
Mm-hmm.
But you find the strengths in the music. I mean, I don't think music has to be perfect top to bottom ever.
I agree. Mike Fraser shared a really great story with me on the podcast a while back when he was working on the Plan Page record. And he said it was the end of the day and the band had gone home and he was listening to Jimmy solo and he thought, I think maybe I can fix this up a bit. So he went in and he just started chopping this thing up and making a few corrections. And the next morning when Jimmy Page came in and hit play, he said, "What happened to my guitar solo?" He said, "Oh, well, I thought it was a bit wrong, and I thought I'd sort of." So he meant well, and and he said, "Let's just undo all of that." He said, "No, fuck my solo, just leave it, man. There's a method in the madness here. That's my intention. Just leave it as is."
Here in these, we teach some workshops here. My friend Chad Bamford and I, we started this thing called Pro Sound Workshop, and it really came down to trying to preserve the art of recording. And one of the things that we stress is, when you're talking to somebody in the same exact tone the whole time like this with the same everything, you don't really pay attention to that at all. It's the inflection when you're talking and the squeak and the low note and the stutter or whatever that makes you take note. And that's why that solo that Jimmy Page played was so perfect, because it had these inflections. And I think the tendency now is to ease that inflection, and maybe technically it's a little more in time or a little more in tune, but those aren't the things you remember in that solo. It's those bends that are maybe a little out or a little sharp or whatever, and those are the imperfections that you fall in love with.
Yeah, tell me about the workshops. What was involved in the workshops, and are you still running them?
We haven't done one this year for the obvious reasons, but we try to do, and the whole basis for it was, it just really came down to trying to build a community as well. I mean, it's started doing these things called the Sunday Night Music Club, which was inviting every person in every aspect of making records, from the techs to the engineers to the mastering guys to the manufacturers to the producers. And it wasn't a NAMM show by any chance. It was maybe 50 people hanging out. Super cool, just discussing life. I mean, because you don't, like I said, you don't really see anybody anymore. So running into somebody at a restaurant and discussing, "Hey man, check out this plugin," or "You know what, I bought this guitar pedal and I used it like this," and then the whole thing about kids coming out of these recording schools and literally not knowing the difference between a male and a female XLR really like started getting me just like, okay, if you're gonna drop 75 grand at that university to learn recording and walk out and not know that, you can come here and Chad and I will teach you. So we got together and we offer a couple different 2-day classes, really. 2 days of drum recording, 2 days of bass and guitar and vocal, 2 days of mixing, and we hold it maximum 10 people. And it really is hands-on. It's in my place, and it's we were doing them twice a year. Occasionally we would do only just 4 days, just mixing and advanced mixing, and then occasionally we would just do the whole 8 or 10 days or 12 days. We would bring guitar techs and drum techs in and have them do a day, or as part of the guitar or the drumming, to have a guy like Bruce Jacoby, who's like one of those guys who's just like, here's a crappy drum kit and I'm going to make this sound as good as possible. And here's how I'm going to do it. Cause those are really the things you need. Like a lot of times nowadays, you don't have the hundreds of dollars a day to pay a drum tech. You need to know how to fix a snare at 1 a.m. that's out of tune, and how to preserve the head that's on there, even though it's probably not the right head. So it really is like a workshop, bare bones kind of, like simple stuff like phase, which is an anomaly to most people.
Oh yeah.
And in the end, it actually has created a community where we see people like, I mean, I still listen to last week. I've been listening to guys making records that took our workshops. And what do you think of this? I think your vocals sound great. The bottom end is not so great. Maybe try this or that. You know what I mean? It's, to me, I want to see them get better. And when they actually do get better, it's like watching your kid grow up,
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's been cool.
It's amazing.
In that.
Almost definitely. It's great. We're living in a time in history where we have access to people like yourself, and those of your ilk, to be able to, share information, whether it's through your workshop or maybe you write a blog or even through direct communication. But 30 years ago, it just wasn't like that. And I think it's great that kids are growing up in that environment, and thankfully there are people that are willing to, give their time and be gracious, and whether they're being paid or not, to be able to impart information and knowledge and wisdom, and pay forward that. And because again, I was just fortunate that I very rarely did I ever come across anyone that thought that they were the gatekeeper to the secret society and withheld any information. And I was fortunate, I just asked a question, and then they'd answer me, and then you take that on board, and then you find a different way of doing it and develop your own style. But I think that the ones who are not willing to share, for me, is a great sign of insecurity within themselves, because we're always learning.
Yeah.
We're always learning, and the kids
Oh,
teach me just as much, I find.
oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I learn every day. I mean, you learn what not to do sometimes as well. I mean,
Oh,
to
yeah,
me, it's always what's on your head right now, those two ears, that's the greatest outboard gear you can own.
definitely.
So we can both have the same SSL console and the same tape machine, the same microphone, the same whatever, same plugin, same settings, and it's gonna sound different because how I hear it and you how I hear it is two different things, and that's what makes you unique, and that's why you're gonna get identified with the things that you do, because you have your twist on it, and I don't have a problem with that at all. I mean, that's just why. What do I have to withhold? It doesn't matter. Here's how I like to do it.
Yeah.
And I had an assistant that would buy guitar pedals that were $20 or under on eBay. And he would come in and play me mixes that were just out of control. And I'm like, it's fantastic, because he didn't need to buy an SSL console. He was running his whole mix like Jason Casaro style, running through two Aphex Oral Exciter pedals before there was an actual plug-in called an Aphex Oral
Yeah.
Exciter,
Yeah. 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 No, absolutely. Absolutely. Joe, it's been a real pleasure. I could sit and talk to you for another 2 hours, but time won't allow us. And I like to try and keep the podcast to a time frame that most people will be able to digest. But I would
Yeah.
love to have you back on again at some point.
Anytime. Anytime.
We
It was my pleasure.
there's just so much interesting stuff to talk about, and topics and stories, and you can't, how do you cram a 30-year plus career into an hour or two or three for that matter. But
Yeah.
it's been a real privilege and a pleasure, Joe. Thank you so much. For just before we go, any last pearls of wisdom you want to throw at youngster who's aspiring to get their foot in the door? What are the things that they can do now about trying to develop themselves, or things to
I mean,
consider?
to
Yeah,
me, it's education. It really is. Like in my day, we'd go to the library. I went to a bookstore. I'd buy used books from everything from modern recording techniques, 1972, copyright, or whatever. I mean, as I read Bass Player magazine, and I might read an article with a bass player I've never heard of and a style of music I don't even particularly know or like, but read how they approach something, and that sparks the idea for the next time you're doing something. So these days you don't have to even get out of your house. You can just go right to the internet and read so much stuff, and just educating yourself in every possible aspect. The person that knows more is going to be the person that could go, oh man, oh, the headphones broke, let me solder that for you. That's the person you want to have around, that problem solver, the person that knows how to tweak an amplifier, or knows how to plug in a microphone, or what a male XLR cable is, or whatever. So I would say read as much as possible, listen to these podcasts, listen to any subject you're remotely interested in. Just go down the wormhole. I spend days in here on my days off. Just I've just tested 100 microphones. I told a friend today that I swapped 40 pickups out of a guitar, and he was just fascinated that I would go down the deep hole, the wormhole like that. And it's something like, how else do you know what something sounds like? And then
yeah,
that you don't have time when somebody's paying you to go, hey, let's pull the pickup out of your guitar and try these 18 other pickups.
Mm.
But you can make a suggestion and maybe and change somebody else's thinking or impart a way of thinking to that person to make their sound and their style better. And so I would say my one piece of advice is, other than, if you take the job, do it 100%.
Yeah.
Regardless if you're getting paid $1 or $1 million, it does not matter.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you again, Joe. Thanks for your time. It's been a pleasure.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much, Tony.
And I know you haven't come out here to Australia, but hopefully one day when the world settles down and the exchange rate's favourable for you, which for the most part it is, but when it is, we'd love to have you here.
Australian bands always want to come to LA for whatever reason, but I would really like to come over there someday.
Yeah, man. Well, if you come to Melbourne, we'll show you around and we'll give you a good time. We'll give you a good time.
Awesome.
Well, all right. Thank you. That's a pleasure. Thanks, buddy. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. So, with thanks to Omega MMA Jiu-Jitsu in 6 Down Street, Collingwood, where we are fully training and getting back into it. If you'd like to come down and join us, please do. So check us out, Omega MMA, and thank you to those guys. Thanks again, Joe Barresi. Thanks again to everyone. Please go to my Mastering Music, Mastering Life channel and subscribe. Give us a little bit of love over there. And as we always say here, please be nice to each other, but more importantly, be nice to yourselves. Okay, I love you fuckers. Take care. We'll talk to you soon.